Joining me now is Kendall Wagerwa, Technical Services Manager with PIC, to discuss farrowing with a focus on peripartum care, which is the extended and comprehensive care provided during the last 3 weeks of pregnancy and the first week after farrowing. Now, why is that time important, Kendall?
This is a really critical time for the success of the sow and the piglet because it includes important milestones like sow weight gain, fetal growth, mammary growth, colostrum production, as well as piglet delivery and farrowing recovery, which we know has an impact on lactation feed intake.
Now, with that in mind, walk me through the goals of peripartum care.
So what we want to do is identify any factors that may compromise the success of the sows and the pigs. So we need to make sure we're controlling risk factors and sow death loss, minimize the number of fat sows that are entered into farrowing, reduce the duration of farrowing to help prevent stillborns and reduce that incidence, and also have a quicker postpartum recovery so that sows can resume eating and drinking.
Now, earlier we visited with Sergio about the 5-step body conditioning program and how that's the only way to attain ideal body condition. And it's proven that that body condition actually helps significantly with colostrum yield and farrowing success. Walk us through this graphic.
So what we're seeing in this graphic is the colostrum yield based on the body condition of the sow. So we can see that sows that are in ideal condition have the maximum yield when we look at them compared to thin sows, but especially versus the fat sows. So this is one reason it's really critical that we have as many sows coming into farrowing in ideal condition as possible. So consider a target of no more than 10% of sows either underconditioned or overconditioned getting loaded into the farrowing room.
Good information. Now, I found this very interesting, that through research that the water is so important, especially during late gestation.
So water should never be restricted in gestation, but it's especially important in late gestation. And our research shows that 80% of sows can be clinically dehydrated in late gestation, which can drive up the stillborn rate. So it's really important that we're providing fresh water every day to the sows so they can achieve a target of 3 to 5 gallons of water per day.
Now, any specific suggestions when they're actually in group housing?
Yes, sows in group housing are typically going to have only water nipples, and there are even farms in individual housing that have water nipples as well. So it's critical that these get checked every day to make sure that they're accessible as well as functional. And for farms that have water troughs in individual stalls, it's really important that we ensure that the water makes it to the end of the trough each time we run water.
Kendall, tell me about the facility itself and how we actually set up the farrowing room for success.
So room setup is really critical to the success of the farrowing process, and oftentimes it's poorly executed at farms. So not only is it going to help the piglets and the sows, it also helps make things easier for our sow teams that have to monitor the piglets and take care of the sows. So we want to focus on factors that impact environment as well as microenvironment. So first we want to start with a clean room. Always use hot water and some sort of degreaser or detergent to wash your crates, and that'll help remove that biofilm that's left on the crates. And make sure we go back and do an inspection of the crate so we can touch up anything that we might have missed. And then we'd like to have the room dry for 24 hours before we load.
All right, once the room is clean and dry, next steps?
Next, we want to make sure that everything in the room is functioning properly before we bring the sows in. So make sure that the room temperature is set appropriately for farrowing piglets. All fans, heaters, and inlets should be working. And check feeders to make sure that there's no disinfectant pooled in the pan, and also that the feed mechanism is working and that they're at the appropriate setting for the sows. Check every single water nipple in the room before sows are loaded to make sure that it's not only accessible, but functional and at the proper water flow rate, and address any of those issues before we bring sows into the room. And then finally, we want to make sure that microenvironment is ideal for the piglets. So make sure all of your heat sources are clean and functioning properly, and that we're achieving a temperature of 90 to 95 degrees Fahrenheit on those piglet mats. And sometimes we need to use a temp gun in order to make sure that that temperature is appropriate, because simply setting your heat lamps all at the same height may not be achieving the target temperature in every crate, as there is some variability. And also make sure that your piglet mats are clean, disinfected, and dry.
A lot of details, but all very, very important. We've set up the room for success. Now what about sow care?
So with sows, we really want to make sure that we're identifying any issues early on and taking action before the farrowing process happens. So we can load at-risk sows at the front of the room, close to the door. Make sure that we're checking for any females that might have hoof lesions or lameness in the farrowing room.
So what can you do to support those females with feet and leg issues?
First, place a rubber mat under any female that has any sort of hoof lesion or lameness, and this will help provide some traction for her while she's in the farrowing room so she can easily get up and eat and drink. And then also be prepared to early wean any females that aren't going to recover. And keep an eye on hoof length. Practice hoof trimming on a regular basis as needed, especially in those younger parities, and also have a plan to remove any animals with extreme hoof growth.
We discussed dehydration prior to farrowing, but what about in the farrowing room itself? I mean, the sows probably know where to go to eat and drink. Do we need to be focusing on the gilts?
Yeah, that's right. Gilts are a special population, and they require a little bit of extra attention to make sure that they're eating and drinking on their own within the first 24 hours. So first we need to make sure that not only gilts, but all sows have a water flow rate of 2 liters per minute. And consider grouping your gilts all together in the same row because that's only going to help your team know where to focus that extra attention. So make sure gilts are getting up twice a day and that we're pressing the water, activating the mechanism on the feeder so that they know where to drink and how to eat.
What about those sows and gilts that aren't drinking?
So those need to be identified promptly and we need to take some action. So one tip that can help a team is simply to sprinkle some feed on the water nipple to identify gilts that aren't drinking on their own because we'll know if that's gone, she drank, if it's still there, we may have a problem female. So get her up and make sure she's not lame or she doesn't have edema. Again, show her where to drink and eat and make sure that all those are functioning properly and then see if you can get her out and take her for a walk in the room and put her back in her crate and try to get her retrained.
So we know water is very critical, but feeding is critical too because if they're not eating well, then they're probably not nursing as well as we want them to. How do you solve that?
Right, so if sows are not eating, they're definitely not providing enough milk and feed for their babies like we want them to. So depending on when you load the room, we'd like to give the sow the same amount of feed she had in gestation up until about 2 to 3 days pre-farrowing. At that point, you can increase the feed so she has unrestricted access from then all the way through her lactation period.
Now, why is the goal to have the sows eating within 3 hours of farrowing?
The odds ratio of stillbirth is reduced if a sow eats within 6 hours of farrowing. So that means we need to make sure she's fed multiple times a day. So if we're hand feeding, we need to be feeding 3 times a day. And with automatic systems, it may even be more than that, depending on how much feed the feed tube can hold.
Now, there are some signs to indicate that farrowing is imminent. Let's go through those.
So before sows even come into the farrowing house, you may start to see swelling and reddening of the vulva a few days before farrowing, as well as that underline, and those udders are going to get really, really tight and swollen. And she may even have milk secretion, so you should be able to milk that teat and get a milk stream. That means we're hours away from farrowing. Maybe have some increased respiration. And then when we get within a day or so of farrowing, we'll start seeing some nesting behavior, so that sow will be rooting around in the crate. When we get within hours of the start of farrowing, the sow will decrease her activity. You'll see her lay down on her side. Right before farrowing, sometimes 30 minutes before, we can start to see a watery fluid with a red tinge in the vulva. And then right before farrowing, we should see some tightening of those abdominal muscles as she starts pushing.
Sow monitoring isn't just about the sow, it's about the piglet too. What are the 3 things to remember about sow monitoring?
The 3 things we need to remember are life and death. So we need to assist sows that need help. We need to keep piglets warm and dry, and we need to make sure that all piglets are receiving their colostrum. So the first hour of the day is really critical because we need to check sows that have farrowed overnight and make sure that we're checking those life and death things immediately in the morning. So we need to address any sow that is having trouble. Any chilled pigs need to become warm and dry and immediately be trained onto an udder. So sometimes this requires a little bit of extra labor allocation because we like to have every sow checked within the first hour of the day or we're going to have problems. So even to add 1 additional person for simply 1 hour in the day to help with that process can make a big difference. So we like to see the farrowing monitor checking sows every 20 minutes unless she's an at-risk sow, and at that point we would want to check a little more often.
Good advice. Now, do you have any specific recommendations to reduce stillbirths?
Yes, so on those at-risk sows, we would like to see those sows being checked every 15 minutes and focus on the P5 plus parities, sows that have a history of stillborn, sows that are actively having stillborns, and also sows that are at the end of their farrowing duration. We know that the incidence of stillborns increases in that last third of farrowing, especially if it's a long duration.
Let's go in a little deeper on this as well. What are some things to look for after farrowing that the sows are actually doing okay?
So sow well-being after farrowing is an indicator of good execution. Take rectal temperatures on every sow 24 hours after she farrowed and treat sows with a fever according to herd veterinarian instructions. And also look for visual signs that a sow is either sick or in discomfort. A sow that lays on her belly is a huge red flag that something's wrong. And we also want to look for retained piglets the next day. Is a sow off feed? Does she have red udders? Those are all signs that a sow may be sick after farrowing.
And what about the piglets?
Day one pig care counts. It's really critical, so we need to make sure that we have a farrowing protocol and that we follow it to ensure all pigs are getting warm and dry and receiving the colostrum they need. And also providing the right microenvironment for the pigs. We want to make sure that we have comfort for the pigs as well as a reduction in pre-wean mortality.
And what is the most common cause of that pre-wean mortality?
The most common cause is pigs being crushed or being laid on. So it's a big red flag if piglets are not laying under the heat source or on a heat mat. Anytime piglets are up near their mother or spread through the crate, that's telling us that our microenvironment is not ideal.
All right, lastly, what are some tips for post-farrowing care?
Check on sows every day. We don't forget about them after they farrow. We need to be checking feed and water daily, provide clean feed every day, scrape feeders, make sure there's no moldy feed, continue to check those water sources every day and address any issues with accessibility or water flow rate. Get your sows up twice a day, every day. And finally, minimize the movements on piglets, especially in that first week, and try to keep 85% of litters intact when fostering.
Very good information. We appreciate you so much, Kendall.
Thank you.